Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner. If you like the show, please rate and review it on the platforms wherever you listen to podcasts, particularly on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find us and grow the show. And of course, you can learn more about Flute New Music Consortium at flutenewmusicconsortium.com. Dale Trumbore is a Los Angeles-based composer and writer whose music has been called devastatingly beautiful by the Washington Post and praised for its soaring melodies and beguiling harmonies deployed with finesse by the New York Times. A winner of the ACDA's inaugural Raymond W. Brock competition for professional composers, an ASCAP Morton Gould Award, and a Chamber Music America Classical Commissioning Grant, Trumbore has also been awarded artistic residencies at Copeland House, the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation, Tucson Talk, and UCross. Her music is available through Boozy and Hawks, G. Sharma, and Graphite Marketplace. Trumbore's book, Staying Composed, Overcoming Anxiety and Self-Doubt Within a Creative Life, was hailed as a treasure trove of practical strategies for moving your artistic career forward by Angela Miles Beeching, author of Beyond Talent. Originally from New Jersey, Trumbore currently lives in Azusa, California with her spouse and an unreasonable number of cats. Dale, welcome to Music Crush. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, first things first, what is an unreasonable number of cats?
I had in my bio a perfectly reasonable number of cats when we were at 3. And then my neighbor showed up with a kitten that he had already tried to get my husband and I to adopt. And we'd said no. And he handed me the kitten, and I found it impossible to hand the kitten back. So now we have 4, which feels slightly unreasonable.
I think it's wonderfully reasonable, and I'm going to ask you for a kitten photo later.
He snuggles with all the other cats, so I can send very cute kitten photos.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's sweet. Elizabeth and I have both been adding cats to our households in the past 6 months or so, and yeah, some days are good and some days are a little challenging with those little idiots, right? My little idiots anyway.
Have you guys seen the social media cat distribution system? Yes. It sounds like each of you was a victim or perhaps a winner of the cat distribution system.
I'm curious now, can I ask how many cats each of you has?
I just have 2, but it's like the personality of about 5 in here. Just enormous, ridiculous personalities, but just the 2. One is 1 and one is 14. So it's odd sometimes.
We have 2 very large dogs, and for a number of years only had 1 cat. And over the summer, we're visited by the cat distribution system. So we're now up to 2 dogs and 2 cats. And with the 4 total, it starts to also feel a little bit unreasonable, although I like to point out that they're at least from different species. So it's variety pack.
Yeah, it's when you start collecting just one that it feels it feels like a lot.
They're fun though. Our younger one, and this will be the last thing I'll say about cats, but our younger one has reminded me anew how quirky and weird every single cat can be. So having multiples just gives you that much more variety in your day. I'm a huge fan.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. I have no segue for that, but as my husband loves to point out, flute players and composers always have cat stories. So I'm sure you're welcome, everyone who's listening. We want to talk about your work as well. We want to talk about what you've got on your workbench at some point today, but I can't not ask you some questions about your book, which I found so inspiring and so in a small library of kind of advice related books for artists, really pretty unique, actually. So I want to dive into some of that, if you don't mind first. Do you think creatives have more of a propensity for anxiety?
So I would hesitate to make any sort of generalization about all creative people. That said, maybe every creative person I know whether they admit it or not, has anxiety issues. Well, I don't technically want to say yes and make a blanket assumption about everyone. I do think it's something that creative people struggle with a lot. And I've found that being open about that anxiety with trusted friends who are also colleagues has led to really wonderful discussions that very often generate tools like the tools that I talk about in Staying Composed, or at the very least offer us the chance to commiserate over our shared sort of neuroses. And I think that that can be so helpful, finding that trusted space where you could be completely honest about any mental health issues that you're struggling with at any given time.
I think it's very generous of you. We're getting a little bit better, maybe, in our generation at talking to our students about it and making, I think societal norms are improving too in terms of talking about mental health as an actual thing. But it's still not great. You still often feel like you have to keep that to yourself when you're just feeling normal human anxiety about things that are very hard and when you're really on the spot in this business. So I think it's very generous of you. You've gone beyond talking to trusted colleagues and just putting it out there for all of us, and it makes the conversation easier for the rest of us too. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just talking to a friend yesterday who was talking about very specific anxiety within her career, and we were both saying, we still feel like there are only so many people when you get to a certain level in your career, especially, that you feel comfortable sharing specific concerns with. And I think that's just another facet of this is it's hard once you do have a certain degree of success. I think you don't want to appear ungrateful in a way for that success by saying, well, I've achieved this and also it makes me feel terrible sometimes. Everything you just said, I think the conversation is improving around all of this, and there's still room to grow, because whenever we feel like we can't talk about something that is a huge part of our life, I think that's really a problem that needs to be addressed.
Can I hop in with a question real quick? We talked to another composer recently who talked about a support system that they had built up around rejection letters. And you've talked a little bit about your support system for dealing with some of the other difficult parts of, working in the arts. How did you go about finding your people and building the support system? Do you have any strategies that you think might be shareable or transferable to others?
I mean, I think in some ways I lucked out, and in other ways I have felt definitely alone in that I had. So let me back up to maybe to high school. I felt like there were very few people, if any, who were creative in the same way, with the same kind of aspirations that I had for my art. When I got to college, I had a lot of friends who were creative in different fields. It wasn't until junior year that I really figured out how to make friends within the music community there. And I think that involves a lot of vulnerability. And I still have issues with this, of course, because I am generalized anxiety and social anxiety. And so it's hard to go up to someone and be like, hey, do you want to grab coffee sometime? Or like, maybe do you want to trade numbers and we could hang out? I did that at a conference 2 years ago where my husband and I had moved to Azusa, California, which is a suburb of LA in LA County, but it's just far enough that we were like, oh no, all of our friends are at least 20 minutes away now. And so I met a conductor that I had a mutual friend in common with and learned she was 10 minutes away and was like, can we hang out sometime? And it still feels vulnerable, but I think getting past just accepting, and this is really social anxiety in general, a lot of it's accepting that you're going to feel anxious, or you're going to feel scared, or you're going to feel intimidated, and then recognizing all of that and letting yourself feel the feelings, not trying not to feel the feelings, but then doing the thing. And if there's any way that you can make that act easier for yourself, putting that in place, as well as just letting things be challenging when there's sort of no way around that. And I think for sure making friends in the music community is part of that. The reason I live in LA is because I went to grad school here and really found so many composers and performers. I have a lot of singer friends here too, as well as composer friends, but just these people that were really, really friendly and really wonderful and really open to these conversations about our craft, about life. And I stayed here because of that community. So I think if you're not finding the community that you want, sometimes that involves maybe not moving, but online seeking out, like initiating those conversations, being brave in the moment, seeing if someone wants to catch up over the phone or over Zoom if it's not, in person for a coffee.
Staying Composed came out in 2019, right? A couple little things in the world have happened since then, I guess. If you were to write a new edition or a sequel, is there any new material or any changes that you would make?
So I've thought a lot about that. And it's funny, I think I do stand behind a lot of what's there. I don't know that there's anything I'd take out. And the things I've thought about putting in are actually more specific insights into process and like thinking more about how I go through the draft process, for example, more so than thinking like how would I adapt this book in case we go through another pandemic? I think I'm going more for universal creative strategies that you can put into practice in almost any situation. But I really did, like, again, most creative people I know, I struggled a lot during the pandemic. I know now, right, there's multiple wars going on. It's a lot harder to create when our attention is rightfully being pulled elsewhere, or our entire lives are being disrupted. I don't want to discount that in any way. I would hope that the message in Staying Composed that we need to be gentle with ourselves. We need to learn when to be gentle with ourselves and when to not expect ourselves to be producing a lot of new material or, rehearsing a lot, practicing a lot. I would hope that that message applies and that people could take that away and apply that to moments of great distress on a global or a personal level.
This is another great aspect to the book. You talk about meaning behind work. I love this. You write that you apply the Girl Scout motto to your work. So could you please explain for our listeners who may have not been Girl Scouts what that means? And then I'm also curious if you had, I'm picking an arbitrary number, 2, 3 pieces from your catalog that you feel help us best understand your ethos.
I did some digging into this quote and realized it's actually scouting in general. And then it's been applied to the sort of hiking community as well. It's this idea of leaving things in a better place than you found them. If you're camping, tidying up your camp space and there's a little bit of trash that's not your trash, but it happens to be there on your campsite, cleaning that up as well and leaving things in really good shape for the next people to inhabit that site. I think about this a lot with music, and it really helps. So I work a lot with words. I don't work exclusively with text, but I do work a lot with contemporary poets and writers in general. And I think if I can find that quality in a poem that I'm setting, that really helps me know that will translate to the music as well. But if there aren't any words, I have to think about how do I convey this idea of sort of meeting the audience where they're at. So not projecting emotions onto them, but rather creating a space in which there's room for them to recognize whatever they're feeling and maybe see themselves reflected in the music itself or in the words as well as the music. And then trying to transform the more difficult emotions that piece contains into something lighter or something with a sense of ease, something with a sense of deeper breath, whether that has words or not. That could be, we don't need words. Of course, you know this because wind instruments, right? We all need breath. We all need deep breath, right? So I think I'm just really interested in the ways that as a composer and also sometimes as a performer too, I can transmit all of that to the audience, knowing that you can't control their reaction. And that's been really helpful too. That's something I talk about in the book as well, is knowing that not everyone's going to respond to your work positively or just in the way that you want them to respond. They might not always get what you're trying to do, but as much as possible, I try and create that space. Again, not like thrusting emotion, not trying to make the music like so maudlin that I'm like forcing you to cry or something, right? I've heard pieces like this, right? Especially when there's text involved. I think there's a way to leave people in a better place emotionally than at the end of a piece than they came to you at the start of a piece without that sort of manipulation. All of that to say, I think for sure the first piece that comes to mind in my catalog is How to Go On, which is a secular requiem for a cappella chorus. And I've heard from some listeners, I'm sure not, of course, like not everyone likes this piece or responds to it, but I know a lot of people have felt that they can process their own grief, no matter what kind of grief that is. They've found a path through it. It's something, sort of eases inside as a result of listening to this piece. For as far as instrumental works go, I have an orchestra piece called Infinitely and Without Apology. And in that piece, in a way, that's about anxiety as well. I was asked to write a piece about being a woman, which is my least favorite prompt that I get as a composer because it's my whole life. I have always identified as a woman. I have lived my life this way. And so you're asking me to write a piece about it. And can you be a little more specific, perhaps? So my spin on this particular piece was to think about confidence and how we develop confidence, not just as women, but as people. How do we work through feelings of self-doubt and come out the other end feeling more confident? And so that's another piece that aims to take the listener on that journey as well, and maybe sort of subconsciously leave them in a state of feeling that like we work through the feelings of doubt and then we come out the other end feeling like a more confident version of ourselves.
For any gender. Who doesn't experience that sometimes?
I won't go into that tangent, but so many of the things that we attribute to gender are just like, no, this is just people.
Human. Yeah.
Everybody's insecure. Everybody, right? Like we don't, again, that's a tangent, but yeah.
I'm going to encourage the tangent on accident. I had a thought or a question that sort of popped up as you were talking. I've been following some of the hullabaloo post Golden Globes, and it has some of the content of the last summer Barbie movie on my mind again. And so you talk about maybe not loving writing about the experience of being a woman as a favorite prompt, but I find myself in a chapter of life where I want to consume all of the media that I can that sort of reflects my experience in the world, with being a woman being part of it. If you could, if is there an aspect of life as a woman that you would like to write about? Is there an experience of humanity that you do wish you had a vehicle to share?
Yeah. So funny enough, it's my least favorite prompt to receive from a commissioner, but that doesn't mean that I don't my own experience and try and convey that right in pieces. But I'll give you an example. So with art songs in particular, and I just made an arrangement of my piece Snow White Turned 60 for trumpet and piano, but it's hopefully going to become flute and piano friendly as well. No words involved, just a little like 10-minute piece. But I have this half-hour song cycle that's about fairy tale characters, but it's weird, like really odd retellings or contemporary retellings, just like the twisted fairy tale trope that I don't get tired of that ever, really. I think there's such a wealth of still things to mine in these like the traditional Grimm fairy tales. So I wrote the song cycle for mezzo in editions for mezzo soprano and soprano. And then I think a few years ago, I had a tenor asked to sing it, who identified as a man, asked to sing it. And I had this moment of like, why am I gatekeeping who gets to tell these stories and sing them? Just because when I wrote the piece, I was drawn to a setting of different female poets. It's about these, traditionally female stories, but that doesn't mean that only women can tell them and identify with them. So I feel like there's a lot of room here. Like, absolutely, I am writing from my experience, and that is feminine and female identifying. I think a lot about that. Like, I think a lot about music as memoir, which is something I want to write about more, because memoir is not just like, here's what happened. It's trying to make something of your story that's useful to other people, which is what I'm all about as an artist. And so I'm thinking about how that comes across in my music, and absolutely my own identity becomes a part of that.
That makes a lot of sense. I think if I lived in the composing world, I would probably be a lot more sensitive to gender being part of the conversation because historically that's been trickier. But again, in the phase or chapter of life that I'm in, I'm really interested in a lot of the woman specific stories. So just kind of an interesting little side tangent. Back on the regularly scheduled program though, we were talking about your book. And in prepping for your interview, Nicole was pulling quotes, and I realized that I stole a phrase I use a lot in my flute studio from you and from reading Staying Composed several years ago. So you write about vaccinating yourself against meanness, and if any of my students are listening now, they've probably heard that phrase at least 10 times in a lesson. Can you share some favorite strategies for vaccinating yourself against meanness? And if you have any new ones since the book came out, I'm ready to crib those from you too.
So now I'm curious whether you have ones that I haven't thought of, but maybe we can get to that. So for me, the main thing here is thinking all of well, first identifying the really wonderful things you love about your piece and identifying things that you don't love as much or that you think other people could find to criticize. And I think this goes for performance, of course, right? As well as composing. It goes for any art form. If you made a painting, you could do the same exercise. If you were preparing for a recital, you could do the same exercise. But once you figure out for yourself what you think about a piece, and knowing that this could change in a few years, but right now you can identify, okay, like maybe this spot is a little weak, could be a little stronger, but I know that. And I'm still really proud of the work that I put in this other spot that I think is just like brilliant, beautiful. And I'm so proud of it, right? Once you have that framework for yourself, there's very little that anyone could say coming up to you after a concert or in a review to make you feel bad about that particular piece in a lasting way. I still, of course, like if you get a terrible review, probably you're going to have a moment or a day of feeling pretty crappy about it. And that's so normal and human and fine. But ultimately, that if I think the vaccination part is it's not that you don't react at all to the thing. It's that you have this little core within you that knows what you actually feel, and that will ultimately override or suppress any negative feedback that comes at you. It doesn't eliminate it, but it helps you have a much broader vision about what is the role of my art or this piece in particular, this performance in particular, what is the role that that is playing in my life. But yeah, I'm curious. I would love to hear how how your students have responded to that.
I mean, typically they look at me like I'm crazy, but I go on to explain to them a concept I think I must have absorbed when I was reading Staying Composed, that, it is very natural, as you said, to have a negative reaction to negative feedback. You're human. And I think the thing I love so much about that phrase is that you're vaccinating yourself against it. It doesn't mean you don't get sick with the negative feelings. It just the reaction is a little bit less extreme and a little bit less long lasting. And as you describe that to up and coming artists who are at various stages of their creative journeys, I'm not sure that always makes sense immediately, but I think as they start to find their own strategies for vaccinating themselves against meanness, I think it makes a little bit more sense. So just giving them a framework to put it in. I've talked about it using your language. I will sometimes talk about, I think, a similar concept or similar process by encouraging them to use the scientific method for their practice or their preparation, because we're usually on like a performance side where I'll say, like, we want to introduce one variable, so pick the variable and then assess what happened. And if you don't like it at the end, it doesn't mean anything. It's just information. A scientist does not get to the end of their experiment and write rage comments about the results of the experiment. They're just supposed to say what happened. And if they have feelings, that doesn't go in the report. And kind of a similar thing, and probably more in line with your like holistic approach. I talk about practice a lot like the way you would talk about training a puppy. because pets are big in my house, as we mentioned. You never yell at the puppy for not sitting. You just create a situation that's going to encourage it to sit. And so in that way, you're, I guess, not really talking about the meanness or the negativity, but you're sort of highlighting and building on the positivity so that any negative feedback is smaller and more in perspective. And that's sort of how we talk about it in my studio. But a lot of it, I think, stems from this vaccinating idea that you introduced.
I love that. Now I'm thinking about how like could composers implement the puppy training strategy? Another thing I really like to think about is the idea of fixing it forward, where if you do the negative things that you don't love as much, you take those and you use that as feedback, and the kind of feedback that you were just talking about, where you observe it from a neutral perspective and ask, how might I do something differently in the future? So with a performance, I feel like one of the beautiful things about a performance is, aside from ignoring for a second that there might be a recording of it, but you do it and it's over. And then with a composition, you could just fuss with it for years and years. And I know friends who do this, but I'm much more I have a very specific process for when I go back and edit a piece. And when I am done with that process, unless there is a typo, I do not touch it. I only fix forward. So I think that goes hand in hand with what you're talking about and very much applies to a performance aspect as well, right? This idea of like, oh, well, I wasn't prepared enough in this spot. So what do I do differently? Or like, I hate the way that I interpreted this little moment, and what would I do differently? And then you just put it towards the next performance. You don't dwell on the past, keep going.
I feel like that sounds really universal to both writing and performance, and I'm gonna write that down and use it again for myself soon.
That's something too. So that idea of fixing it forward, and then I talk about rinsing the rice sometimes with this idea of draft process, where like with a composition, these are things for your earlier question about what I would put in Staying Composed now. This idea of like doing drafts one more than you're comfortable doing. So when I'm rinsing rice, I get impatient. I'm just an impatient person. So you're supposed to rinse rice until the water is running clear. And I will like, it's almost clear and I'm ready to be done. I'm like, can't I just make the rice now? Why do I have to rinse it again? Or like keep, running water over it and swishing it around. But the idea of like rinsing the rice as it applies to drafts is, once you hit that uncomfortable feeling, that means you need to go at least one more because you're not done.
How would that translate, do you think, for performers, Elizabeth?
I mean, if you think 5 repetitions is enough, then do 8. I don't know. Can you get away with 2 more before whatever you were working on starts to feel a little bit shaky? Is it really in there?
Yeah.
That's my instinct. What do you think? You always have the really nifty little practice approaches.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I mean, sometimes I don't feel like practicing, and I know that I need to, and I know if I don't, it's just going to be harder. If I take 2 days off, going to be harder to sound good 3 days later, no matter how many decades I've been playing. And so I try to think of, I actually learned this from a horn player friend a million years ago as a student at Brevard. One summer, I said she was always the first one up and out the door to go practice, even before breakfast. And I was like, you are like a machine. How do you do this? Do you ever take a day off? Do you ever get sick of this? And she's like, oh yeah, there are tons of times I don't want to practice, but I just make myself do it for 5 minutes. I think, I can do anything for 5 minutes. And then when I'm done with that 5 minutes, if I'm not hooked in yet, I'll just do it for another 5 minutes. Like you can endure any bit of tedium, for that short period of time. So maybe I am also guilty of not rinsing the rice thoroughly though, but I try to be more thorough with my flute rinsing.
I really like that. There's advice. I think it's Ramit Sethi who writes about money and business, but his whole thing is, and like habits a little bit. His whole thing is floss one tooth. Like if you want to develop a flossing habit, you tell yourself, I'm going to floss one tooth, and that's what that 5 minute practicing sounds like. Because if you can just get yourself there,
yeah,
you floss the second tooth, you floss the third tooth. But
right.
yeah, I repeat that. That's one of the little phrases that I repeat to myself.
That's
And
good.
I think he's the one who he might be quoting someone else.
Of all the advice you give, Dale, what's the bit that's hardest for you to follow, do you think?
I think anything about relaxing, to the point where I just finished a big project and it was a 70-minute long choral piece. So, like a concert length choral piece that I've been working on for 2 years. And we premiered it. This group in Seattle, the Esoterics, performed it and they recorded it. Hopefully, it'll be out later this year, which is exciting. But I got home and was just kind of deflated. And there is a chapter in my book about this. And I know theoretically what it says, but I had to literally grab my own book from the shelf because I was just driving myself nuts. I was like, I have another piece due in like 10 days and I need to be working. And no. Like the book, the book is like, be gentle with yourself. Plan like coffee with a friend to decompress. Save like a book or a movie that you're excited to watch and do that. And I was like, no, like boom, right back into my routine. I have a deadline. And I just driving myself nuts to the point where I had to force myself to reread my own book and take my own advice.
Nice.
So yes, relaxing. And that's very much my personality. I think it goes a little bit with the brand of anxiety that I have, but where it's like I need to, or maybe this is completely separate, but like the type A, I need to prove my worth to myself by getting work done. And that is so not it. That's right. Like our lives are about so much more than that. And that creating good work is part of having a good life, if that's something you're called to do and derive joy from, is creating that good work. But there is a lot more that we can do to preserve our own mental well-being.
I love stories of people busting themselves, not taking their own advice. They make me very happy. And it also reminds me of an experience I had. I read Staying Composed the first time in a book club with a couple of other creatives. Most of them were flutists. One of them, a composer flutist, so she was reading more for the composition side. And I remember we were reading the chapter where you talk about giving yourself rest. It's funny that you brought that up. You were talking about giving yourself rest after projects. The composer was talking about how she always does that and she feels like it's super important. And I don't remember why, but I was like, "Oh, that doesn't sound like advice that I need. Like I don't stack stuff up against." And I went on some long tirade about how I don't schedule things back to back to back to back. And my friend the composer went, "Girl, what?" in the way that only my friend the composer can, and basically called me on my shenanigans. And I remember leaving that conversation thinking like, she's crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. But then I caught myself doing it a couple of months later, and it worked very, very, very badly. It's good advice. Give yourself a crash period after after a large project like a recital. Don't schedule something the next day. But that kind of brings us to our next question, which Nicole wrote, but I stole because I needed it. Your writing is very, very, very self-aware. You sound like you are very aware of your strengths and your weaknesses. What is your advice for someone like me who clearly has a little bit of work to do in that department for becoming a little bit more functional if you maybe aren't as conscious of your strengths and your weaknesses?
I mean, I think I imagine that like this is part of what I do is writing to work through what I'm feeling and noting what I'm feeling and when. So it wouldn't have to be any sort of formal journal. Like I know some people hear journaling and they're like, oh no, which is fine, but just maybe noticing like I'm starting a new project. How am I feeling about that? I'm in the middle of the project. How am I feeling? The project is approaching. How am I feeling? I'm doing the thing. How am I feeling? The thing is over. How am I feeling now? And just noticing like are there peaks and valleys to that experience? Are there specific emotions that come up in different phases of where you are in a creative process, in preparing for a recital, in any of that, right? And very likely you'll notice patterns, I think, in how you're feeling about what you're doing. And the same goes for like during the day. If you're trying to practice in the morning or you're practicing in the afternoon, you're practicing at night, how do you feel? Like, is there a natural time of day where you feel more inclined to create? I talk about circadian rhythms, right, which is like when we're predisposed to want to sleep or be awake, be productive. And I think, I know at least for me, I have creative rhythms as well, where I love composing in the afternoon. I like doing business things in the morning. The only other person that I've met who has the same creative rhythm as me is the composer Alex Shapiro, who's awesome. But I haven't met any other afternoon people. There's like morning people and evening people, and the two of us. But all of that to say, just keep note, and it can be in your mind, but it probably would be more effective written down. Notice how you're feeling and when, and how that corresponds to the things that you do that you will keep doing. Like if you are preparing for many concerts, right, that's something you plan to keep doing. You plan to keep practicing on a maybe near daily basis. It's good information to have, knowing like, okay, if I have to practice late at night, I'm not naturally a night person, so I'm going to feel a little tired and cranky about it, right? Or maybe that goes for the morning. You're not a morning person, and so you're going to be dragging your feet, and it's going to take 20 minutes to kind of feel alert enough that to be getting the results you want in that practice session. Or I know for me, I say so often that there's a point in my creative process where I hate everything about the project I've created. I hate it, and it's like 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through. And it happens every single time with literally every single project I create. And sometimes I think I've escaped it. But if I'm writing a piece in a day, which I don't really do, I haven't really done since college, but if I'm doing that, it's going to happen at that exact 3/4 of the way through the process. And if I'm writing a piece for 2 years, it's going to happen 3/4 of the way through the process. It doesn't matter the time, like I just cannot escape it. So I have to figure out how to work through it, how to move through it as gracefully and as kindly to myself as possible.
I love that. And I love that you talked about hating the creative process partway through. I think for a long time, I thought that that was something unique to me and my own special human experience. But I remember that being a very popular portion of the book during our book club.
Yeah, I truly like still think that I can escape it sometimes, and I never have, and I am sure I never will.
The composer friend that we were reading with identified very deeply with that portion and has talked about it in conversations I've had with her since. I think you're probably not alone there.
I'm thinking of my own instances when I was younger, particularly when I was not aware of things that were really valuable information for me to have about myself. And I think it was a friend who pointed out in grad school that 2 weeks before a recital, I would all of a sudden start questioning every single piece I had chosen way too late in the game, right? The programs were printed, and I would think, is this music bad? Are people going to hate it? Or, am I playing it wrong? Like, is my interpretation just so stupid and terrible? 2 weeks before, always. And I was saying something, I was complaining about how awful I was, and this friend said, wait a minute, is your recital in 2 weeks? And I was like, I'd stop and think, and I was like, yeah, I guess it is. And he was like, yep, right on time. That's you. I was like, please elaborate. And that was me learning, not figuring it out myself. That was me learning that I become very difficult to live with 2 weeks before a recital. But knowing has made it easier. I now, since then I've been able to identify and say, oh, that's that thing that I do too late. Yeah, I've chosen this music, I've chosen these interpretations, and I did it thoughtfully, so I'm just gonna plow through. So this idea of journaling, or whatever people want to call it, if they don't like journaling, sounds like another kind of practice, actually, which seems like a great idea. If you're not accustomed to paying attention to yourself in this way, I certainly, that's what I was thinking when I came up with that question too, was I'm not always great at that. Just stopping and asking yourself honestly what you're experiencing seems like it could create a really nice habit of being able to do that more automatically in the future.
Yeah, I would think so, and I would hope so. And I'm hoping if people are listening to this and want to test it out and they want to let me know how that's going for them, I think that would be wonderful. Yeah, as you were talking about that point in your process too, I feel like this is the beauty of having these conversations,
Yeah.
uh, especially across like not just composer, but composer to performer, and across different art forms too. Like I love talking about creativity and craft with like a photographer or like other visual artist or a choreographer because there's so many similarities, and I think we can only benefit from talking about, like, we don't realize those similarities unless we talk about them. But that, I call it in one article, I call it the days of suckitude or the day of suckitude, where I'm like, everything sucks. But the fact that you can have that, it's not just about your creative, thing that you have put on paper. It can be about the art that you're making in the rehearsal process. It can be right in programming. Once you know that, you just figure out how to be kinder to yourself and how to not let that derail your entire the work you've put in so far, and to not let that voice tell you that, or to acknowledge the voice and then really ignore it, learning
Yeah.
which voices to listen to and which to ignore. And I was listening to a podcast, We Can Do Hard Things, and in Doyle's podcast, I was listening to Elizabeth Gilbert talking about her practice of like writing letters to love, and love responds to her on the page, and how all these people give her pushback. You're listening to this voice in your head that you think is like love or God or something, like that's so weird. And she's like, well, you listen to all the voices that tell you that you're garbage. So why wouldn't you? What if we practice listening to the voices that tell us we're doing well? And yeah, I thought that was so funny because it's so, like, I know it's so true. Like, why are we inclined to believe the voices that tell us this is terrible and you're awful and you'll never do anything good? Why do we give that so much power in a way that we don't give attention to those feelings of, this feels really right and good and I'm on the right path and I'm doing the right thing?
Well, let's talk about your music. I mean, I think most of us know you a lot for your vocal work, and you've referenced some of that, but you do have a little flute sprinkled in your catalog as well. In addition to, of course, large ensemble works, you've got some chamber music that includes flute. And because Elizabeth and I are flute players, we always like to ask you about flute. I really like To Live in Los Angeles. That's for flute, oboe, marimba, and piano. I think that's seems like great fun. I'd love to play that someday. How do you know, since it's not a default for you, how do you know when you need a flute?
I think like a lyrical brightness is when I feel a flute is called for. And I've really been trying, I've been thinking a lot about how I want to be writing more for brass and woodwinds. And I have all these choral pieces, and I've been thinking a lot about the similarities between these instruments that require breath and the vocal lyrical writing that I do already. Asking, can I make arrangements of, like, I have this one art song for soprano called This Thirst in the Lungs that is very high. It's for like very high coloratura soprano. And I keep thinking, like, I wrote it as if she were a flute for this one singer friend, right? I wrote it as if Jillian was a flute. She's not a flute. She's a person who had those high notes then, and 10 years later is like, maybe I'm more of a lyrical soprano than a coloratura. Yeah. So all of that to say, I want to be writing more for flute and other instruments that use breath in the same way that I'm used to writing for, essentially for breath, right? For air, for words on air, but the music is music, whether it has words or not, right? But yeah, I wrote a piece called Charting the World for chorus and string quartet and flute that premiered in New York a little under a year ago. And whenever I'm using instruments, I like to think of what role the instruments are playing in that particular piece. I was thinking of, it's these poems about watching children acquire language in a sort of like a playful way or a more serious way. And like, are they talking about their dreams the next morning? Are they learning to count to two? The string quartet was sort of this illustration of the imagery that was being discussed. And the flute was sometimes part of that and sometimes got to stand alone as almost like a narrator figure, or like the parent figure narrating these poems. And I think that just brings me joy in my practice to like give each instrument like a personality or a very specific role? Are they commenting or are they guiding the whole thing? Like, are they the omniscient narrator? I don't know that that flute for me has one particular role, but I think it varies in every piece. And I love flute choir. Like that's something else too, where I need to lean into that more, I think, in my writing, because I just love the sound, like especially like in an orchestral context. But I'm like, why don't I arrange some of my treble choir pieces for flute choir? Like, why isn't this happening? Maybe 2024 is the year that it happens more, because I love that sound.
They will get played. That's a slightly controversial statement. Not everybody says I love flute choir, but that's wonder. I mean, like we need more really beautiful, interesting music to play for flute choir, I think.
I love some of your choral works. So if they do become available in flute choir format, please let me know. That'll happen. That has to happen.
Let me know which one. Like we'll talk
Yeah.
after, but just give me some titles, and this is the year I'm trying to just make those arrangements happen.
In this vein, I love it. I love it when the interview leads to the next question. In this vein, we've been asking all of our guests if the ideal collaboration could just fall in your lap tomorrow. If somebody called and said, "Hey, I need you to do XYZ, you're going to be working with ABC." Who's calling you? What do they want you to do?
So that's something else I've been thinking a lot about lately is I've been trying to set goals. I've been thinking about this for years, but trying to set goals not with specific collaborators. So not being, I mean, like I live in LA. It would be cool if the LA Phil called and I worked with the LA Master Chorale a lot. They were like, we want a really big, like a choral symphony. That would be great. But I'm also trying not to get too attached to wanting a specific collaboration to come through,
Sure.
unless it's someone that I know. And I've been trying to lean more into working, like having had one or more collaborations with someone, trying to go deeper into that collaborative relationship, doing something bigger there. So it's almost like the opposite. It's weird. Sometimes it's like aiming for the smaller names of and stuff, like not being like the New York Phil, the LA, right, the whatever. I found sometimes when I put something on a pedestal for a really long time and then it finally happens, I actually find it underwhelming in some form. Not always. There's some really, high profile things I've done that have been really great, but sometimes it's like, oh, like that performer is really actually unprepared, or like, oh, everyone thought there was going to be a conductor for this, and there's not now. Like, it's 24 hours to the concert, and we're all screwed. Your question is really, like functionally, it's identifying the people that I really love working with, or that I've worked with in a smaller capacity, and asking like, could I write them like a 20-minute or 30-minute or 70-minute piece, right? Or could I just something that feels really meaningful for both of us? Those are where I usually find the most rewarding sense of a successful collaboration.
That sounds like a really healthy approach to life, and I'm going to think about that a lot. I want to re-ask the question though, and you can shut me down if this is the same thing. Is there something you're kicking around in your head right now, like a piece that or an instrumentation that you are just looking for the right excuse to write?
Yeah, there's a piece that I think this collaboration is going to come through in a specific way, but there's no contract yet, so I
Sure.
won't talk about it in that way. But exploring the like Demeter myth from this perspective of like losing a child and watching a child. It's weird. I should say, I guess I should preface this with like I don't have kids. I'm not planning to have kids, and so it's interesting that I'm sort of coming at some of these pieces from a perspective of like watching my brother have a kid, or being like getting to know my friends' kids, and watching my really close friends sort of all have their first child around the same time. But this idea of like losing a child that then comes back to you in some form, marrying that myth with contemporary poetry. I'm really intrigued by that. And that's something that I'm still working on the texts and getting the texts right for that. But I think that would take the form of chorus and orchestra and could be really cool. So we'll see if that happens in the way I want it, or one of the ways I want it to.
What's currently on your workbench, if you can tell us?
Yeah. So I have a piece for chorus and string quartet for the Atlanta Master Chorale. And then a piece I'm writing for a summer choral festival that's going to be chorus, piano, harp, and cello that I'm excited about. So really, I'm the things I'm most excited about right now, I think, are pulling more instruments into the vocal medium that I've written for. To be perfectly frank, kind of tired of writing like 5-minute pieces for chorus or 5-minute pieces for chorus and piano. So I'm trying to ask, how do I, like, I love writing for voices, but how do I pull that into sort of a different space? And then also making arrangements of these existing, like I talked about, arranging a choir piece for like brass quintet, or arranging an art song for clarinet and piano or flute and piano. How do I take my existing catalog and let it be more than what it is currently? Like really just make the most of it.
Dale, we always love to end with this question. We always learn some new things from our guests. Can you name 3 pieces of music you'd like our listeners to explore?
Yeah. So my music, or just music in general?
The question used to be 3 pieces of music you're listening to right now. And people get the deer in headlights, like when we ask them to say something. So it doesn't have to be your music. It can be like stuff you're listening to write your music. It can be stuff you listen to in the gym. Like, what you got? What do you like?
Lately, I've been listening to the band Ila Bamba and liking them. I was gonna say, like, I think one of my all-time favorite choral pieces is the Messiaen O Sacrum Convivium. I always feel like I'm saying Latin terribly. O Sacrum Convivium. And I really love the pizzicato movement of the Ravel string quartet. That's a favorite. And yeah, I also like my first love, which I've talked about on other podcasts, but Tori Amos is like I can always return to Tori if I just am feeling like, what is life and what is music and why do I make music? And then I'm like, no, like, you love music. And this was like the first singer-songwriter that you ever loved. And so I find that's always like a good place to return to, is listening to like Little Earthquakes or Under the Pink, which are the two, aside from liking the Spice Girls and like Celine Dion, were their first like big pop music loves. I grew up with I was like a musical theater loving child, but yeah, I can always come back to Tori and just remember like why I got into composing in the first place. Even though she doesn't write for chorus or anything, but
I think it's the first time anybody's mentioned Tori Amos, and now that it's happened, I'm kind of mad it took this long.
She keeps coming to LA when I'm traveling, and I'm so sad. I'm so sad. Like, I've missed 2 concerts, and then the last concert of hers I went to in LA, I got COVID for the first and only time. But it was worth it for Tori.
I hope it wasn't too bad. Did you get very sick?
It was I mean, it was like standard COVID, which is still awful, but I would knowing that it wasn't that serious of a case of COVID, I would do it again for Tori.
Well, Dale, thank you so much. We're honored that you joined us today. This has been loads of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions, and I'm feeling especially inspired now to go write more for flute, so check back.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.